Everything was working great in my system, but then my AC pulley's bearing seized. Okay, so that's problem number one. Problem number two, a seized bearing still in operation means that the nose of my compressor shredded away. Okay, and then problem number three, like I mentioned, due to the overheating, my thermal protector sensor also failed. Okay, what's up you guys, it's Mike. You guys are going to learn about AC compressors in this video, and more specifically you're going to learn about the AC compressor electromagnetic coil that sits in the very back on the nose of the compressor. Then you're going to learn about the pulley and the bearing that sits right in front of that, and then you're going to learn about the clutch plate, which are the three main components that sit on the end of your car's air compressor that are the most vital parts, the main wear and tear of this thing that you're going to be experiencing. So stick around, learn air compressors for the next 15 minutes, and I bet you'll be better for it. Here we go. Basically, your car AC air compressor, they all kind of work the same way. It's a completely sealed and closed system that is then pressurized and filled with refrigerant, and then as it runs, it's even further pressurizing over and over again. Now, that pressurization of that refrigerant leads to the cold air. So let's just imagine that your air compressor is sitting there, okay? It has all these pipes coming off of it that lead to a closed system, okay? Fully closed and leak proof is really important, and full of refrigerant, okay? You know, there's a bunch of pistons inside of it, or there might be like a scroll type of compressor where the scroll is oscillating and it's pressurizing the refrigerant. In order for those pistons to move, or, you know, for the scroll compressor to oscillate, in order for that to happen, then we need some sort of rotational movement, right? Some sort of energy transfer. And so that's where on almost every car, the serpentine belt system comes into play. So basically your engine is spinning its crankshaft, its output shaft. When it does that, it's making the belt move. And so the belt is then routing across all the different components in your car's engine, right? One of those components being the air compressor, okay? So a belt is running over the pulley of your air compressor, okay? And that's what's giving it that rotational movement. We've now established that you have an air compressor, and on the front of it, there is a pulley that has grooves to accept your serpentine belts, okay? And so, boom, there you go. That pulley is going to be one of your first points of failure, because every time your car is running, that pulley's spinning, okay? That pulley spins on an inner bearing, okay? And that bearing is mounted on what is called your compressor's nose. Knowing that your pulley is spinning 24/7 if the engine's running, because the belt runs over that pulley, and knowing that there's a bearing inside, and now you know that that bearing sits on the nose, well, that bearing can get worn out, okay? There's little balls inside of that ball bearing. It could be a different type of bearing, but those get worn out, okay? And if those get worn out, that pulley will lock up, and it'll no longer spin around that compressor nose as the belt runs along it, okay? So that's just the very first step, okay, is that there's a pulley on the nose of that compressor. Now, remember, we need to actually apply that rotational force to the pistons that are inside of your compressor, or the oscillating scroll that's inside of your compressor. We need to apply that rotational force. Just because the pulley's spinning does not mean that the pistons or the scroll inside of your compressor is activated yet, okay? So that leads us to the next component. So let's go to the next component. That's called the clutch plate. The clutch plate sits very, very closely to the pulley wheel, and only when it's engaged with the pulley wheel does it actually turn the pistons or the scroll inside of your compressor, okay? So now you know there's the pulley, you know there's the bearing that the pulley is fused with and spins around and relies on. And then now we've just learned about the clutch plate, which is the plate that sits right before the pulley. It's a separate piece, and it sits right before the pulley, just a very small gap, okay, sitting away from the pulley. So this is where we learn about the third part, okay? There's a third part that actually sits, instead of in front of the pulley, which is the clutch plate, there's a piece that sits behind the pulley, tucked inside of the back of the pulley, which is a coil, okay? It's known as the coil, which is an electromagnetic copper wound component, which is tucked inside of the back of the pulley, okay? With just a little bit of clearance so that the pulley doesn't actually rub on it. What this electromagnetic coil does is when you turn your AC on, it sends volts through it, and whenever volts are going through that coil, then it makes the pulley magnetic, and then therefore making the clutch plate, which was sitting with just a small air gap, magnetize to the pulley. Now let's get into some things that can go wrong. So once again, the compressor itself with its pistons inside of it, or its scroll inside of it, on the end of that compressor where there's a nose, You put the electromagnetic coil onto the nose first. It's typically held on by snap rings or lock rings. Then goes the pulley, which has on the back of it an indent that fits perfectly over the electromagnet. Okay, boom, sits right there. And then you take your clutch plate and you put that right there, okay? And then just a little side note, in between your clutch plate and your pulley, there are clutch plate shims, which help you build out the clutch plate as much as you may or may not need to in order to get that air gap perfect, okay? So you can get that air gap just right so that it doesn't friction and rub when the AC is not on, but that it's not so far that when the electromagnet turns on that the clutch can still magnetize to the pulley, okay? Now let me just get into very quickly what happened with my AC, and before we hit the 10-minute mark, I'll try to finish this. Basically, with my AC, the bearing inside of the pulley seized up, right? And so the bearing froze up, and the pulley kept wanting to spin because the belt is still spinning around it at a high speed. So if you drive and keep driving while that's happening, the inner race of the bearing that's pressed into the pulley starts to grind away on the nose of the air compressor, okay? That's one of the faults that happened with mine. So not only did the bearing fail on my compressor, but then because the pulley was still spinning, but the bearing was seized, it ground away the nose of the air compressor that the pulley is supposed to be pressed onto. Problem number 3 that happened, all this excess heat made my electromagnetic coil overheat. That's the one that's behind the pulley, okay? That fits into the indent on the backside of the pulley, okay? And it makes it magnetized. Now, when that happened, my electromagnet didn't actually fully fail. It actually just burnt out the thermal protector. So the thermal protector is a little accessory part in the circuitry that's a tiny little sensor that senses when there's too much heat. And when there's too much heat, it cuts off the electromagnet. In my case, that little sensor got so overheated that it kicked off forever, right? Now that I fixed my situation, I had to also fix that sensor because the sensor got burnt out permanently. Even though it's not overheating and hot anymore, the sensor wasn't turning back, into safe mode. It was stuck permanently on triggered mode, if that makes sense. Everything was working great in my system, but then my AC pulley's bearing seized. Okay, so that's problem number 1. Problem number 2, a seized bearing still in operation means that the nose of my compressor shredded away, okay? And then problem number 3, like I mentioned, due to the overheating, my thermal protector sensor also failed, okay? So in order to fix these 3 things, number 1, I got in there, snipped away the old thermal protector and spliced in a new little thermal protector. Okay, you're gonna have to look at that for your situation and see if that's even applies for you, right? In my case, it was a little bit special because my car is a hybrid and it had 2 thermal protectors, therefore making it more likely that mine would have failed. In your case, you almost surely have only 1 unless you also drive a hybrid. And if you only have 1, that means that it's less likely that your thermal protector is the problem in this current situation. Now, let's move on to the next point of failure, that seized bearing. Well, that's easy enough to change out because you just simply remove the pulley and you would use either like a press or a socket that's exactly the size of that pulley, and you would hammer out the old pulley or press out the old bearing, and then press in a new bearing, okay? So that's easy enough to fix. Now, maybe the hardest one to fix was that now when you take your new pulley and your new bearing and you slide it onto the compressor nose, remember that compressor nose now saw a lot of friction and has now dwindled down to losing multiple millimeters of diameter, okay? So the bearing, even though it's the same factory size, no longer fits on there like it should, okay? So in order to fix that, what I did was I cut a little rectangle snip right down to the millimeter of the exact size of an inner ring of the bearing, okay? And it was just enough to, bend into a circle and put it in there along with the bearing to make a perfect fit again. So in other words, I had to put a little sheet of aluminum in there, a separate sheet of aluminum, freestanding aluminum, into the inner ring of the bearing, into the inner race of the bearing, to shrink the inner diameter of the bearing down just a little bit more to then install it onto my what was a shredded down compressor nose. You know, there's only one electrical component on your air compressor, and that's that electromagnetic coil. And so all it needs to do is get power, right? And once it gets power, it's just supposed to magnetize that clutch plate right to that pulley. So as long as your pulley's spinning on a nice bearing, as long as your belt is going around like it's supposed to, as long as your electromagnetic coil is receiving power, and as long as your clutch plate is properly not frictioning when it's turned off and it's properly magnetizing when it's turned on, then in those regards, your air compressor should be working like it's supposed to. Now, then of course we move over to refrigerant leaks, refrigerant levels, and also the pistons or the scroll inside of your compressor is a whole nother level up to where now we're talking about actually removing the compressor completely and redoing the seals or the pistons or the bearings that are actually inside of the compressor. That's a whole nother story. So if you made it this far into the video, I hope I spread some enlightenment on you guys. I hope I make it a little bit easier to fix your problems. And if I did, please subscribe, hit that like button, hit that notification bell, drop a comment below. Let me know how I could help you. And if you still need help, let me know by asking a question below. Thank you guys so much for watching.